This is Dalton Jeffries. He's had 4 surgeries, including 3 Tommy Johns. And although he made it to the big leagues just a little while ago, he never thought he'd play baseball again. But now, he's up to 95 miles an hour and he's getting multiple offers to go play at a high level again. So in this video, my co-founder Albertus is going to break down exactly how he was able to rebuild Dalton's mechanics from his late arm, how his pelvis was firing, and many, many more, so that not only does he throw harder, but stay healthy. So if you're a pitcher who needs to gain pitching velocity and stay healthy, this might be the most valuable video that you see. Let's get straight into it. All right, so Dalton Jeffries, how hard was he throwing before he started working with you?
When we started, he was upper 80s, touching 92 at maximum. And I was sitting here looking at this guy after 4 surgeries, still moving extremely well, but suffering in some pretty big mechanical issues. And I was like, okay, we got to fix this guy. So I went ahead and reached out to him and sent him a DM. And I was like, hey, I'd love to work with you. We'd love to bring you on and help you change your career. But let's go ahead and hop on a phone call and get a mechanical assessment. The big thing with Dalton in his career was that he couldn't remain healthy. And this is an issue because if you're in the big leagues and you cannot remain healthy, you clearly can't be in the big leagues forever. And this is a guy who just has always dominated every level that he had been at, but health was a big factor of him not being able to continue to dominate these levels. And mechanically, the first things I noticed was, 1, his arm was extremely off time, and so it wasn't even close in a position to be on time to kick into external rotation and initiate the throw from the torso, just dragging the arm, because his arm was trying to play catch up the whole time. And the other issue on top of that was it was amplified by his pelvis plane of rotation, because his pelvis plane of rotation was upwards. And so because his pelvis plane of rotation was upwards, he was jumping down the mound, right? And so this is important because when the pelvis plane of rotation is upwards, we're going to have later ground contact time, which means if the arm is late when we have later ground contact time, it means when we have proper ground contact time and proper pelvic plane of rotation, that the arm is going to be considerably more late. And this was more than likely a byproduct that had started happening in his mechanics because of the bad arm timing and his body wanting to clear extra room and timing for his arm so that it would be a little bit more on time. And this is why when we're addressing mechanical issues, we need to look up and down the entire chain, because we could have something that's bad, but when we fix something that needs to be fixed in another area in his mechanics, it gets amplified even more. And so the first thing that we had to tackle was specifically the late arm and getting the arm load phase into a position to where it would actually be on time by full weight-bearing foot strike. Because if we would have tackled the pelvis before the arm would have been even more late, which would have placed even more stress on his arm, and then we would have potentially put him in another injury deficit that's just totally unnecessary, especially because when you fix something like the pelvis, you get a lot of velo from it, okay? When the pelvis is wrong, it means that there is a ton of velo in this person that hasn't been unlocked yet. And so if we add all of this velocity onto him and he still has a bad arm action, then he's just going to be getting way more stress on his arm.
Before we keep going, if you're a guy who needs help gaining pitching velocity, you can go down below and book a call with me personally, and we can talk about your situation and come up with a game plan for you to start throwing harder. Or you can just send me a message on Instagram and I'll get back to you.
When you fix something like the pelvis, there is a ton of underlying velocity that is going to be added because the pelvis is extremely important, right? Some people view the pelvis as being driven by the spine. I simply think that that's impossible, especially if we look at how kinetic energy works in the human body and the musculature of the human body and how those areas are set up. It's not probable, right? It's just a theory. And so the way that I look at the pelvis is the lower half drives the pelvis. It drives the rotational energy. It drives setting up the pelvis. And the core helps open up and change the certain positions you can fire it on. So it's not firing the pelvis by any means, but the lumbar being an extension, flexion, or neutral will definitely impact the areas and how the pelvis can fire. So it was like, okay, we teach him how to fire the pelvis downwards, utilizing his back leg and specifically feeling some cues when it comes to rotating the pelvis. And we wanted to get him as many quality reps off of a slope as possible. And so we started with a half slope, which was the mound that goes onto flat ground. We progressively worked on transferring those feels to the mound.
I was going to ask you about it, but how did you fix the arm action?
So the first thing that I did to help him fix the arm action was we went ahead and set an underload standard for all of his plyos. And the reason why we did this is because I wanted to give him lighter balls that would force him to build a quicker impulse getting up to load, rather than if I give him a ton of heavy balls, we might develop more range of motion in his shoulder girdle, pec, all of this area, right? But that's not necessarily what we want. We don't want that at all for a person like this. So when a person exists in these parameters, you give them considerably lighter balls because this doesn't allow them to get as deep or elongate these actions. It forces them to be shorter and more efficient. The first cue that I gave him was, hey, we're going to draw like an invisible line across our chest with the ball, and then you're just going to flip it up however feels comfortable for you. And so utilizing his fist and the ball, he would draw an imaginary line across his chest and he would get his arm up on time. Versus previously, what would happen is he would get this forearm angle super downwards, and this would cause him to be loading more into his trap. And this was the range of motion that was causing the delay in arm timing. And so we had to completely remove that by establishing a new and more efficient arm action. So we had to get pretty robotic with it for a little bit. And for guys like this who have been in the big leagues, they have ultimate feel over their body, right? And so when you give a guy this feel who has this level of athleticism and proprioception, they get it really quick. It's just a matter of, will these guys actually listen to you because they've been in the big leagues? And luckily, Dalton is a very humble human who's always willing to get better, versus some of the guys that I've worked with, you know, it's like pulling teeth. It's very difficult to get them to try these feels. Even when they do it one time and it immediately works, they'll just go off on their own tangent and do whatever they want to do. And keep in mind, that's also why they got to the big leagues in some regard as well, is by just staying true to themselves. But that's a conversation for a different time. So
is that different to shortening the arm action?
We shortened it, but only because the range that was elongated was in inefficient areas. Like, we could technically elongate his arm action by building deeper ranges of motion throughout his shoulder and pec, and teach him how to utilize T-spine extension properly to grab even deeper ranges of the arm. But we don't want to do that, considering even with this efficient arm action, he's still a little bit off time, right? Like, his arm isn't perfectly on time, and that's just because we also shifted his pelvis to fire properly, so he has less time now to get the arm where it needs to be.
No, I wanted to quickly touch on that because people think that, you know, after the Spencer Strider thing, everyone thinks that, oh, shortening the arm action is just the answer to all arm action problems.
Yeah, so let's definitely touch on that, because a lot of people think that, hey, if I shorten the arm action, it's going to do exactly what I want to do, but that's not necessarily the case. Your arm action is a byproduct of your tempo, how quick you can get your arm to certain positions, and what ranges of motion that you have in your body that dictates what your arm action should be. So for somebody like me who was a 1-4 to the plate and got in extremely deep arm actions, that worked fine because I had enough time to get into those ranges and didn't have to speed anything up or force these unnatural movements with my arm to get it how it needs to go. Versus if I would have shortened my arm action a lot, my arm would have not had the proper room that it needed for the torso to fire the arm, and it would have become more of an elbow-driven throw because I removed some of that range of motion. Versus some guys are a lot quicker and they have super long arm actions, and so their arm is playing catch-up the entire time, and it's never going to be able to catch up because it's just not how their body should move. So you have to look at, okay, how tall is this guy? How big are his levers in comparison to his body? What is his rhythm and tempo like? Is it like too fast for his arm, too slow for his arm? And how do we adjust everything to where he's grabbing his arm at the right time, right? Because if the arm's too late, you're not going to be able to get all the velocity from it. The elbow and the shoulder are going to have a ton of stress. Keep in mind that when we think of a late arm, we're thinking of getting to the positions it needs to get to transfer into the next part of the throw. We're not thinking of, just the arm dragging behind, because theoretically speaking, your arm is always the last thing in the chain to go. So it's always going to be late per se, right? So you need to view the arm action as being late as, is it ready to take the transfer of energy from the torso, right? And if the answer is no, then it's not on time in any regard. And sometimes it will actually start to dictate how the torso moves and completely remove the rotational energy that we just created, right? Because if we create a whole bunch of energy here rotationally from the bottom of our trunk, but then our elbow is going, then our energy is just going to basically meet in the middle, and then we've killed the rotation up the chain, and now we're driving the throw with the elbow. So we're not transferring anything that we just developed either. And that's a really big issue, right? Because how the arm receives the energy is important for a couple of reasons. Typically, when we have an extremely high internal rotation velocity thrower, they don't throw near as hard as they should, and that's because their arm is compensating to move as fast as it humanly can to throw hard, because it's not transferring energy well up the chain. Versus if we look at someone like Bauer, who throws mid-upper 90s, he has an extremely low internal rotation velocity for his throwing arm because he transfers energy so well. And so ultimately in high-level throwers, we're trying to partially drive down the velocities that the arm creates and transfer more energy from the rest of the body so that we're removing stress, they can recover easier, throw harder, and it doesn't do as much damage. Because you can have a 5,200 internal rotation velocity speed and throw 91, and you can have a 4,000 internal rotational velocity speed and throw 98. Okay, and these are two very different velocities, but one person is throwing 91 to have way more stress. Even though they're moving quicker, they have way more stress than the guy throwing 98 who's not moving as fast but can transfer his velocity properly. And so this is a concept that a lot of younger players don't understand. They think that the arm is just the driving factor of velo, and the faster you can move the arm, the faster the baseball is going to be. But the reality of it is it's typically the inverse. And the faster we move the arm, if it's not accepted by the body properly, then the more velo we're removing from ourselves and the more stress we're putting on our body. So it's a lose-lose,
Do you have an analogy for that? Because it's so trippy, right? It's like arm speed doesn't equal higher velocities. And something that I was like, what? How does that even make sense? And I started to think about like something like a catapult, right? If that's a good analogy, like if you have a heavy weight and then it like builds up over time. But I don't know. Do you have a good analogy for
the one that pops into my head, because I've never been asked this question, but the analogy that pops into my head is like, think of if we're driving a manual and we're shifting gears, right? If we shift our first 3-4 gears well, but then all of a sudden we shift the fifth gear extremely early, we might blow out the engine, right? We might blow out the engine. So we might have got 80% of the way. In the last 20% of the way, we blow out the engine, we stall the clutch, and all of a sudden the vehicle is shutting down. So we're not going to reach the top speed that we should be reaching because we messed up that last 20%. I always like to use an engine because it's just like very relatable and understandable for a lot of people. Think about that, bro. We shift to gear 1, lower half, we're good. We shift to gear 2, pelvis fires, we're good. Gear 3 is the torso and starting to transfer to the arm, and then we're good. And then when we shift to that last gear, if the arm is just moving considerably faster or it goes earlier than it should, we're going to stall the clutch or blow out the engine, right? And then we're going to have to shift back down gears because we couldn't reach the top speed or the timing that we needed to get into that fourth gear. So it's like that to me really relays what it's like to have an early arm action versus if we properly shift into that fourth gear on time, we're going to have a much higher top speed and it's going to be a much smoother ride. But when you shift gears early or shift gears wrong, the whole car jerks. Like everything jerks or the whole car is going to stall down because you just slipped the clutch. So that's my analogy on that is we're trying to shift gears on time. And if we shift gears too early, it's going to be a bumpy ride. And you're going to feel it, because when you perfectly shift gears while driving a manual, you can't even tell you shift gears. But if you're at all not on time, it's like it moves. It kicks a little bit.
Last thing I wanted to ask you real quick on the arm action is another thing that I see a lot is everyone thinks they have to be perfect 90 degrees like this. Is that true? What's your thoughts on like being a little bit more down here? I don't know.
If you're here, it's typically only sustainable if you're going to be a submarine guy because they have to clear extra room. But for everybody else, you want to be somewhere in like this range. You don't want the shoulder to be forward rolled a whole lot because then you're just throwing all of that extra range of motion directly into the elbow, right? Because that's where Tommy John comes from, is this initial switch from here to here and then accepting that force and throwing. So if you have to throw more force into your arm, then you're just putting all of your stress right there because that is the mediator of the two joints, right? Like that's the one that steps in to accept valgus force. And so this just throws a ton of valgus force into the elbow, but it's also throwing a ton of force into the rotator cuff. So it's a double whammy of not being good. Versus when you're on time, your arm just relaxes and lays back, and then the torso throws it. Versus like it trying to speed itself up to get to where it needs to get to on time. And also the more variability that you have, like with having this area, the more you're going to have inconsistent supinated releases or pronated releases depending on whatever your body favors. Because you're going to have different arm timing based on fatigue the whole time, right? When I shoot my pistol 10 times, the barrel starts heating up, right? And so the bullet starts moving differently. And so you could kind of consider this like fatigue for the arm. If I keep throwing and I've thrown 10 times, my arm's going to start to get a little slower. It's going to start to get a little bit tired. It's not a very resilient thing in terms of everything else we're comparing it to, like the spine or the quads or the legs, right? It's not the most resilient thing in our body by any means. And so as it fatigues, this timing will shift more and more and more and more, and especially because it's extra stress on those areas. And so this will just lead to more inconsistent pitches and feels as everything progresses. Because of that slight amount of extra stress, you're basically just heating the barrel up of your gun faster and causing everything to shift faster.
Was there anything you were going to talk about on the pelvis? I know we talked about it a little bit.
After we fixed his arm action and we got the arm action to a place where the timing was sustainable, the next thing became, okay, now we need to teach him how to ride the slope of the mound and use the pelvis to fire down the slope of the mound. Because a lot of people see the mound as this surplus, and that's why they throw harder. But it's really just a surplus of range of motion for us to fire on, which means it's a deficit. So people don't understand that sometimes. They're like, how is it a deficit if we throw harder? It's like, well, because you can also use the momentum generated from the angle of the slope to throw harder, right? So you can gain velocity from it if utilized correctly. But think of it like a Jefferson curl, right? Like if we do a Jefferson curl on plates, we're in a deficit. So we're going to have more range of motion to work through, which is going to make it a more difficult lift. But that being said, there's ways that you can also, lift more weights with it if you really understand the lift and you build the proper end range strength, so on and so forth. So the same thing goes for the mound. We have more range of motion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to utilize it properly. And so your brain thinks of every single area that you throw on as a different stimulus. So up a hill, down a hill, flat ground. Your brain moves differently according to the surface and the angle of the surface that you're on. So much so that your brain will throw different on gravel. Your brain will throw different in a parking lot. Your brain will throw different downhill, flat ground, on grass. Your brain will throw different on grass if you don't even have cleats on because it knows that you're going to potentially slip, and so it will create these mechanical patterns to help you not slip, which most of the time are bad. But anyways, it became, how can we get him to feel his pelvis rotating diagonally down the mound? And so I gave him a couple cues with the back legs and then also just firing the pelvis in general. And the one that stuck for him was just like actually feeling his pelvis rotate. A lot of these players need some type of magical cue, like rotate your back knee downwards, or rotate your back foot downwards, or feel the hip rotate downwards. But the one that worked for him was simply just feeling what it is, which is rotating the pelvis downwards. And a big part of that was teaching him how to stay relaxed in his legs during that drift phase. Because a lot of players will stiffen up as they start to go into that drift phase. And so you won't see them get any more depth in their back leg. They'll just lock up their knee, lock up their hip, lock up the back leg, and then they'll just coast like they're on flat ground. And so when learning how to throw on that mound, you have to learn to have a little bit more relaxed lower half so that you can utilize and ride the slope. Because if you tense up, you're just going to rotate like you're on flat ground. And so the feel became, all right, we're going to feel the pelvis rotate downwards, but for that first part of the drift phase, we need to be as relaxed as possible and sit a little bit more in our legs as we're starting that stride phase. That really helped him feel it, and then paired with the fact that he has a little portable mound, like a half slope that he can take everywhere, we could really expedite everything because now we were working on some type of slope. But we did run into some issues with that because even with the half slope, right, like you go down, but then it's flat. Versus on a mound, it's downwards the whole time. At no point does it go down then flat. And so that last little part of him being able to get the final part of that pelvis rotation and fully get it downwards, we didn't unlock until he started having more access to a mound. Keep in mind, when we first started working together, Dalton had no potential belief that this was going to be a real comeback. He didn't even want me to post any stories about everything because he was scared that his bosses would see it and that they would fire him for trying to chase what he wanted to do. And so originally, he was just doing this for fun, and he wasn't sure if we were ever going to go anywhere or if he was ever going to fix these issues and throw hard again. It was just a pipe dream at the time for him. So after we fixed the pelvis, because he had a lot more access to facilities, at this point it's just making sure we keep those patterns because he's still patterning the final athletic part of that. He's still relatively fresh and picking up these new mechanical patterns. And so he's only had the first initial jump of velocity from having better patterns, but he hasn't had the second jump of velocity from fully utilizing these patterns in an athletic way, as athletic as it could possibly be, because when you work on stuff robotically like this, it expedites the whole process by 2 to 3 times quicker than it would be if you just did drills to fix it. But there is 2 separate times of velo jumps, right? So you're going to get it done 80% quicker, but you have to realize that you're not going to have like one big fluid jump like the people who spend a year on it will. You're going to have 2 separate jumps of velo, from 1 when the pattern is first fixed, and then 2 when it fully implements itself based on your mechanical patterns and your mechanics fully accepting it, plus accepting the higher level of output that you've now just developed, right? Because we can take a year to fix something and yeah, it'll get there, you know, but if we can cut it down to 3 to 5 months, especially for a guy like this, we'd be dumb not to. We'd be dumb to not get robotic and not get a little bit in the Superdome for a second, because we're just costing him time that he doesn't have. And the opportunity cost of that time is potentially him getting signed or not, right? And if we would have taken that full year and just fixed it with drills or constraints and never got robotic with it, he just would have showed up to this pro day and sat 90 to 92, 89 to 92, and nobody would have ever called him. And he wouldn't have felt good, and he wouldn't have been even close to ready. And so in just a couple months, this guy went from not even being indie ball ready to now being minor league and big league ready because of how we tackled this problem and expedited his development, which is really important, especially in an industry now where people are arguing about cues and no cues and getting robotic and not getting robotic. But if the best in the game are always working on something and sometimes feel robotic when they're working on something, I can't possibly see a world in which that's wrong, you know, especially talking to Kershaw and Shohei and Joe Kelly and Craig Kimbrell and all these big names from working at these different places over the years. They're always working on something, right? They're never satisfied. And they'll tell you as well, the second you get complacent is the second that you die. And that's true. In this game, when you get complacent and you think that you've got it all figured out, it will find a way to show you that you're not even close to correct. So we're always trying to fix or master something, but the goal is never to just do nothing, right? So yeah, there's going to be people who might not ever think, and that's phenomenal. Congratulations to them. You know, they might not ever think, and they might just be a freak of nature who just coasted their way there. And that's what happens in real life and business and every other aspect. But the people who leave impacts on this game that completely change the game and make it to the Hall of Fame, they are very tedious human beings because they understand that perfect practice makes perfect. Believing and trusting in your process means sticking to the same things. And we have to always be looking for something that we can improve on. That being said, if you don't have a realistic gauge of what you actually need to do, you need to have somebody in your corner to help you, because it's a lot easier to coach other people than coach yourself if you're an elite competitor. Because an elite competitor is going to be so picky when viewing their own mechanics that they think it all sucks, even if they're throwing 103 miles per hour. And this is just one of the plagues of being an elite competitor, because there's give and takes in every mental spectrum, right? And one of the takes of being a psychopathic elite competitor is you're always going to think you suck. Even if you have a .5 ERA and throw 103, you're always going to think that you should throw 105 and have a 0 ERA. So that's why it's good for those guys to have resources to kind of reel them back. Otherwise, they're potentially going to implode themselves from greed.
With the higher level guys like Dalton, do the velocity gains pretty much all come from mechanics, or did you do anything on the lifting side?
No, he did our lifts, but it's all mechanics when you're that level of an athlete. The lifting stuff for those guys is just to keep them healthy, you know? Like, you're basically just doing maintenance with a slight uptrend, but it's like when we have a guy like that who's already thrown mid-upper 90s, we don't need to develop him to throw mid-upper 90s. We need to develop him to sustainably throw mid-upper 90s all the time, right? And that's going to come from his mechanics typically, especially somebody who's had 4 arm surgeries that were driven from mechanical deficiencies. But the last thing that we want to do is just start piling stuff onto this guy who is already a top 1% athlete and just take away from his throwing results, because he can clearly already throw hard and he's clearly already developed the base for everything. And so there's just no point to just brutally force the weight room, you know. There's no point. It's all mechanical for these guys. Unless they just have some type of neuromuscular guard that's not allowing them to throw how they should, and we can partially remove it in the weight room by finding triggers, so on and so forth. But no, most of this stuff is just maintenance, keeping their power output high and keeping them move well, which is why if you look at Cressy, you know, Scherzer's not ever lifting heavy, you know, and he's thrown 94 to 98 forever. Verlander's never lifting heavy. These guys don't lift heavy. You know, they don't lift heavy. They're just lifting for maintenance and power output. Because, I mean, why would we need Scherzer to go deadlift 500? You know what I'm saying? Why would we need Verlander to go deadlift 500? The thing about it is, too, is if you're training properly and training consistently, you'll still have strength gains even from non-maximal strength work. You'll still have strength gains from power work. So it's about understanding what constraints that this person's body has and how do we keep him as healthy as possible while pushing forward his throwing. Because, like I said, this guy's motor recruitment is already off the scales. You know, we don't need to advance that. We need to shift the mechanical patterns, keep him active and consistent in the gym, and the rest will come.
I don't know if it's the same stuff, but how you kept him healthy.
Yeah, so we kept him healthy by giving him just what he needed in the weight room to keep everything at a slight uptrend but not remove anything from his throwing. And then obviously the weight room focus was a lot of unilateral stuff, a little bit of bilateral stuff, but it was a lot of unilateral stuff, specifically because he was going to start using his pelvis differently, which was going to require more out of his block because of the earlier ground contact time. So it was a little bit of unilateral strength work to help assist him in fully patterning the feel of utilizing his block earlier and having that quicker transfer of energy. And then we shifted into a little bit of power stuff to take that newfound strength and then apply it, right? But another reason that we gave him that stuff is we wanted to make sure that he was at his previous peak levels of strength before just forcing a new power adaptation, right? We wanted to make sure he was primed going into this pro day. And so it was just that paired with proper post-throw recovery that just targeted specifically the areas that he struggles with most, which is just keeping his elbow and shoulder healthy and force acceptance of those areas, and then a little bit of isometrics to help build stronger ligaments and tendons in those areas over time in specific end ranges. So it was nothing crazy by any means. We didn't need to reinvent the wheel for him, but it was just exactly what he needed, not trying to force some crazy weight room adaptations, because the focus was, hey, we only got a couple months to get this guy ready for a pro day, right? I don't have 6 months. So it was one of the quicker transformations that we've ever had on the table, and making sure that we got him entirely focused on gaining velocity meant that we have to kind of pull off the weight room a little bit, because if we're focused on weight room adaptations, it's going to take 8 to 12 weeks for us to get those full adaptations. And he only had 12 weeks to get ready in general. So just not possible. So we could only do 4 to 6 weeks of strength, and then we shifted into strength speed, and then we shifted into peak power / maintenance. And now at this point, we're still working on some power and strength stuff. It's more in a hybrid phase to keep him ready and progressing. But he's probably going to go play baseball soon, and so we'll shift to in-season maintenance at that point. And then making sure that he communicates with me after every outing how he feels, where he's sore, and what's going on, so that we can tackle any other potential issues that could arise during season, because a lot of people don't realize that a minor league season is basically entirely working on staying healthy, because that's harder than all possible development aspects and throwing harder. Staying healthy through 150 plus games is 3 times more games than you play at the highest level before that. So, it's just a totally different level of workload, and the main focus is health at that point. You know that these guys are going to go compete. That's what all this work was for. Now it's just a matter of keeping them healthy so that they can continue to trend upwards, get used to the workload, and not have any hiccups when it matters most. I would just say that another thing that was important during his training phase was we had to remove the guards that he had established in his brain from having 4 surgeries. And so while they didn't necessarily show up in his mechanics, there is an aspect of baseball that players have to understand where you have to turn your care off about your arm when throwing, right? We can't have this predetermined thought that we might get injured. The thought has to be, I might get injured, who cares? You know, because ultimately you're producing enough stress on your arm to snap it every single time. And the more that you think about that, the more you're going to shift your mechanical patterns around that thought process, which means you won't decelerate properly and your body will compensate. And then you're going to place more stress on your arm. And so it was all about getting him back to that mindset of like, we got nothing to lose. We have nothing to lose. Nothing matters. We have everything to gain. Let's not even worry about the arm. Let's just go in there, not care, trust the process, have fun, enjoy every moment, and not worry about any potential downsides. And this is normal when working with a lot of rehab guys, because they'll get sore a little bit in previous areas that were worrisome, and all of our thought process is like, oh no, did I do it again? Because I've been there too. And so all of our thought process is like, oh no, did I ruin this area again? When it's just a little bit of soreness. And so you run them through the tests, show them everything's good, and then within the next week that soreness will go away. But you have to make sure that you're monitoring these people and not allowing those guards or problems to creep back up into their brain. They basically have to have this not give a shit mentality. Like, nothing matters. I have nothing to lose. And that's really one of the only ways you can learn how to throw harder as well, because if you're always worried about throwing hard and damaging your arm, I'll promise you right now that you'll never throw hard. I've never seen a single person in that boat who has ever thrown harder than 90 miles per hour. Yeah, you have to learn to not care and put everything on the line. And then once you understand that concept, you will finally be able to throw hard. But that's just a mental aspect of this game people just rarely talk about, mainly because the people talking about it never even knew that that was a thing, because they obviously never threw hard either.
If you've watched until here, chances are you're a guy who needs to gain pitching velocity to get to the next level. And so if you're that guy, then go below, book a call with me. You'll talk to me personally about your situation, see if we can help you and how we can help you. Or if you don't want to book a call, you can send me questions to my Instagram and I'll get back to you.